The morning mist clung to the Irish coastline as Brother Finian knelt in prayer within the stone walls of the monastery at Rathlin Island. The year was 795 AD, and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore had always brought him peace. But on this dawn, something else cut through the silence, the rhythmic splash of oars and the creak of wooden hulls. When the monks first glimpsed the sleek longships emerging from the fog, their dragon-headed prows carved against the grey sky like harbingers of apocalypse, they believed it was a vision. Some fell to their knees in prayer, others ran toward the bell tower to sound the alarm. But there would be no divine intervention, and there would be no escape. The raiders moved with the precision of wolves. They had done this before, many times. As the first Viking boot touched the rocky shore, Brother Finian's world transformed from sanctuary to slaughterhouse. The screams that followed would echo across the island for hours, but for most of the monks, the terror would last much longer. Those who survived the initial assault faced a fate that medieval chroniclers could barely bring themselves to record. They would be chained, stripped of their humanity, and dragged across the cold waters to markets where human beings were bought and sold like cattle. This was not warfare, as the Irish understood it. This was harvest season for human flesh. What Brother Finian experienced was not an isolated tragedy or an act of desperate barbarism. It was business calculated, systematic, and fundamental to Viking society. The raid on Rathlin Island was merely one entry in a ledger of human trafficking that stretched across medieval Europe like a vast bloody web. The Vikings were not simply warriors or explorers, as popular culture suggests. They were professional slavers, operating what historians now recognize as medieval Europe's most efficient human trafficking network. For over 3 centuries, from the 8th to the 11th century, Viking slave raids supplied a commodity more valuable than gold, silver, or amber: human beings. The Old Norse word, thrall, meant slave, but it encompassed something far more comprehensive than modern understanding suggests. These were not merely servants or laborers. They were property, living assets to be bred, traded, tortured, or killed at their owner's whim. The sagas speak of slave markets in Dublin, York, and Hedeby, where human beings were examined like livestock, their teeth checked, their muscles tested, their reproductive capacity evaluated. What follows is not folklore or legend, but documented historical reality, stranger and more disturbing than fiction. This is the story of how an entire civilization built its prosperity on the systematic destruction of human dignity, and why virtually no one who found themselves in a Viking slave raid would have possessed the knowledge, strength, or opportunity to survive it. Viking slave raids operated with mathematical precision that would have impressed modern military strategists. These were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations that targeted specific populations during optimal conditions. Archaeological evidence from trading centers like Birka and Hedeby reveals the sophisticated infrastructure built around human trafficking. The raiders studied their prey with clinical attention to detail. Monasteries were preferred targets, not simply because they contained treasure, but because monks were educated, valuable commodities in markets where literacy commanded premium prices. Coastal farming villages were struck during harvest season, when populations were concentrated and unable to abandon their crops. Young women were taken during religious festivals when they gathered in predictable locations. The annals of Ulster document a systematic pattern. Viking fleets would establish temporary bases on offshore islands, then conduct coordinated strikes along hundreds of miles of coastline. The Irish chronicler known as the Four Masters recorded that in 821 AD alone, Viking raiders abducted over 4,000 people from Ireland's eastern coast. These numbers represent not casualties of war, but inventory for slave markets. The selection process was brutally pragmatic. Children under 8 were typically killed immediately. Too young to work, too difficult to transport adults over 40 faced similar fates unless they possessed specialized skills like metalworking or medicine. The optimal slave was between 12 and 30, strong enough for labor, young enough for decades of servitude, attractive enough for sexual exploitation. Those who survived the initial selection faced immediate psychological conditioning, designed to break their will to resist. According to the Icelandic Gragas law code, newly captured slaves were kept naked and chained for the first month of captivity. They were fed minimal rations and forced to sleep in their own waste. The purpose was not merely practical restraint, but the systematic destruction of human dignity. The most disturbing aspect of this process was its efficiency. Viking raiders could process hundreds of captives within hours of a successful raid, sorting them by value condition and market destination, with the cold precision of butchers preparing meat for sale. The longships that carried Viking raiders were not merely vessels of war. They were floating prisons, designed to transport human cargo across hostile waters. Archaeological reconstruction of ships, found at Gokstad and Oseberg, reveals modifications specifically intended for slave transport that demonstrate the industrial scale of Viking human trafficking. Below deck, parallel to the rowing benches, iron rings were welded into the hull at precise intervals. These attachment points allowed slavers to chain dozens of captives in rows like cargo, the spacing approximately 2 feet between rings ensured maximum capacity, while preventing captives from coordinating escape attempts. Waste buckets were positioned at calculated distances, but captives chained at the far ends of each row could not reach them, forcing them to soil themselves and their neighbors. The journey across the North Sea typically lasted 5 to 8 days, depending on weather and destination. During this time, captives received one meal daily, a thin gruel of barley and water that provided barely enough nutrition to prevent death from starvation. Those who became seasick were not released from their chains, forcing them to vomit and defecate where they lay. Ship manifests, preserved in runic inscriptions from the Hedeby trading post, reveal the systematic dehumanization of this transport process. Captives were not recorded by name, but by category: young female breeding age, male, strong back, child, house service. Like livestock, they were branded with their owners, marked typically a heated iron pressed into the shoulder or forehead. The mortality rate during transport was staggering. Skeletal remains found in ship graves at Kaupang show that approximately 30% of slave cargo died during sea voyages. But this loss was calculated into the business model. The profits from surviving slaves were so substantial that losing nearly a third of the human inventory was considered acceptable overhead. For captives who survived the voyage, arrival at a Viking trading port marked not the end of their ordeal, but its transformation into something potentially worse. The slave auction block, where their remaining humanity would be systematically stripped away and commodified. The slave markets of medieval Scandinavia operated with a commercial sophistication that rivaled any legitimate trade center of the era. Dublin, established by Viking raiders in 841 AD, became the largest slave market in Western Europe, processing an estimated 1,000 human beings annually at its peak. Archaeological evidence from excavations beneath modern Dublin reveals the physical infrastructure of this human trafficking hub, holding pens, auction platforms, and examination areas where potential buyers could inspect their intended purchases. The Kogad, Gaidel, Ray, Galaib, an Irish medieval text, provides harrowing details of the Dublin slave markets. Operations. Captives were segregated by sex, age, and perceived value. Women of childbearing age were housed separately and subjected to invasive examinations to verify their fertility. Young men were forced to demonstrate their strength by lifting heavy stones or performing labor tasks, while potential buyers observed. Children were separated from parents immediately upon arrival. Family bonds were considered detrimental to creating compliant slaves. The pricing structure reveals the cold mathematics of human commodification. According to preserved transaction records found at Birka, a healthy adult male slave cost approximately 12 silver marks, equivalent to the price of 4 dairy cows or 6 horses. Young women commanded higher prices, particularly those with fair complexions, who would appeal to Middle Eastern buyers. Children were valued primarily as long-term investments, their lower initial cost offset by decades of potential labor. The most disturbing aspect of these markets was the systematic sexual exploitation disguised as commerce. The Byzantine chronicler Ahmad ibn Rustar described Viking slave traders who would examine the women like mares and force them to strip completely while buyers evaluated their reproductive potential. Pregnant slaves were sold at reduced prices, but buyers could negotiate breeding rights to future children. The auction process itself was designed to maximize psychological trauma. Families were deliberately separated and sold to different buyers, ensuring that emotional bonds could not provide comfort or motivation for resistance. The Arabic geographer al-Masudi, who observed Viking slave markets in the 10th century, wrote that the sound of weeping from separated families rose above the market like the crying of seabirds, but noted that buyers showed no emotion. Human suffering had been transformed into routine commercial transaction. Once purchased, slaves entered a system designed to erase every aspect of their former identity and replace it with absolute subservience. The Icelandic sagas contain detailed accounts of slave conditioning that reveal the sophisticated psychological manipulation employed by Viking masters to create compliant human property. The process began with the ritualistic destruction of personal possessions. According to the Landnámabók, newly acquired slaves were forced to watch as their clothing, religious symbols, and any personal items were burned in ceremonial fires. This was not mere practical necessity, but deliberate psychological warfare designed to sever connections to their former lives. New slaves were assigned numbers rather than names, and responding to their birth name was punishable by savage beating. The Gragas law code specifies that slaves who spoke of their homeland family or previous life were to have their tongues pierced with iron pins as reminder of their new status. Speaking in their native language was forbidden. Slaves were required to communicate only in Old Norse, further erasing their cultural identity. The living conditions for slaves were designed to reinforce their subhuman status. Archaeological excavations at Icelandic farmsteads reveal that slave quarters were deliberately constructed below ground level, forcing occupants to climb down into their dwelling places like animals entering dens. The ceiling height in these slave pits rarely exceeded 5 feet, preventing inhabitants from standing upright and creating a permanent posture of submission. Sexual exploitation was not merely tolerated, but institutionalized. Viking law explicitly granted masters unlimited sexual access to their slaves of any age or gender. The concept of rape simply did not exist in the context of slave ownership. Slaves had no legal right to refuse their owners' demands. Female slaves were often forced to serve as concubines while their children automatically became property of the master. The most psychologically devastating aspect of this system was its use of slave hierarchy to prevent unity among the oppressed. Long-term slaves were given authority over newcomers, creating a caste system that turned victims against each other. Those who demonstrated absolute loyalty might be elevated to trusted slave status, given slightly better food and housing in exchange for helping to control other slaves. This systematic destruction of identity was so effective that many slaves eventually internalized their status as property. Runic inscriptions found on wooden stakes at Birka include statements carved by slaves themselves, describing their owners' virtues and expressing gratitude for their treatment, evidence of successful psychological conditioning that transformed human beings into willing property. The Viking slave trade was not a peripheral activity or opportunistic. Raiding it was the cornerstone of medieval Scandinavia's economy. Archaeological analysis of silver hoards throughout Denmark, Norway, and Sweden reveals that slave trading generated more wealth than all other Viking commercial activities combined. The systematic exploitation of human beings funded the construction of great halls, the forging of weapons, and the expeditions that carried Viking influence across Europe and beyond. Trade routes established by Viking slavers stretched from Ireland to Constantinople, creating a network that historians now recognize as medieval Europe's most extensive commercial system. The primary chronicle describes how Viking traders transported slaves down the Volga River to reach Islamic markets in Baghdad and Cordoba, where European slaves commanded extraordinary prices. A fair-haired Scandinavian woman could sell for the equivalent of 40 gold coins in Middle Eastern markets, more than most Viking warriors earned in an entire year of raiding. The scale of this human trafficking defies comprehension. Conservative estimates based on archaeological evidence and contemporary chronicles suggest that Viking raiders captured and sold over 500,000 people during the 3 centuries of their most intensive slave trading activity. Entire regions of Ireland, Scotland, and northern England were systematically depopulated by slave raids. The economic model was self-perpetuating. Profits from slave sales funded larger ships, better weapons, and more extensive raids. Successful slave traders could afford to maintain private armies, enabling them to capture larger numbers of victims and establish permanent trading posts in conquered territories. The wealth generated by human trafficking allowed Viking chieftains to purchase loyalty, expand their territories, and increase their capacity for future raids. The most revealing evidence of slavery's central role in Viking society comes from burial sites throughout Scandinavia. High-status graves regularly contain the remains of sacrificed slaves, not as honored companions in death, but as property to be used in the afterlife. The Oseberg ship burial contained the remains of at least 15 individuals who were clearly slaves killed to accompany their mistress to the grave. Their skeletons show evidence of violent deaths and lifelong malnutrition, stark contrasts to the elaborate burial goods surrounding their owner. Legal codes from the Viking Age treat slaves as livestock rather than human beings. The Norwegian Gulathingslot specifies penalties for killing another man's slave that are identical to those for destroying his cattle. The law makes no distinction between accidentally killing a slave and accidentally killing an animal. Both required the same monetary compensation to the owner, with no consideration for the loss of human life. The most disturbing aspect of Viking slave culture was not its brutality, but its coexistence with an elaborate code of honor that supposedly governed Scandinavian society. The same warriors who composed epic poems about courage, loyalty, and noble death participated in a system of human trafficking that reduced thousands of people to the status of animals. This contradiction was not overlooked by contemporary observers. The Arab chronicler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered Viking traders along the Volga River, wrote with obvious bewilderment about warriors who would die rather than show cowardice in battle, yet felt no shame in selling children into sexual slavery. The Byzantine historian Photios described Viking merchants who prayed to their gods for protection during dangerous voyages, then sacrificed captured slaves to those same gods upon reaching safe harbor. Viking women enjoyed remarkable freedom and legal rights compared to their contemporaries in other European societies. They could own property, request divorces, and participate in business transactions. Yet these same women participated enthusiastically in the slave system, owning human beings as household property and treating them with casual cruelty that shocked even medieval observers accustomed to violence. The sagas reveal this moral schizophrenia in stark detail. The Laxdæla saga tells of Gudrun Osvifusdottir, celebrated as one of the great heroines of Icelandic literature for her intelligent strength and fierce independence. The same saga casually mentions that she owned dozens of slaves and once had a slave woman beaten to death for dropping a valuable piece of jewelry. No contradiction was perceived between celebrating Gudrun's noble character and recording her participation in casual murder. Religious conversion to Christianity did little to resolve this paradox. Viking converts continued operating slave markets and trading human beings, while simultaneously building churches and claiming divine blessing for their activities. The Heimskringla describes King Olaf II of Norway, later canonized as Saint Olaf, personally supervising slave auctions while wearing a cross around his neck. The most revealing example of this contradiction appears in the Volsunga saga, which celebrates heroic virtues like courage, loyalty, and honor, while simultaneously describing the protagonists' casual ownership of human beings. Heroes perform magnificent deeds to win fame and glory, then return home to estates maintained by slave labor, seeing no contradiction between their noble aspirations and their participation in human trafficking. This paradox was not accidental or unconscious. It was built into the fundamental structure of Viking society, which required the systematic dehumanization of outsiders to maintain the elevated status of insiders. The Viking slave trade was not an aberration or a product of primitive barbarism. It was a sophisticated system of human exploitation that funded one of medieval Europe's most successful civilizations. The longships that carried raiders across treacherous seas, the silver arm rings that symbolized Viking wealth, the great halls where warriors feasted and composed poetry. All of these achievements were built on a foundation of human suffering so systematic and extensive that it challenges modern understanding of what civilized society means. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is how efficiently this system operated without widespread moral opposition from within Viking society. The same culture that produced intricate artwork, complex poetry, and sophisticated navigation techniques saw nothing wrong with reducing human beings to commodities. The Vikings were not ignorant savages. They were intelligent, organized people who chose to build their prosperity on the systematic destruction of human dignity. The archaeological evidence speaks with chilling clarity. Iron shackles found in every major Viking settlement, slave quarters built into the foundations of prosperous farmsteads, human remains showing evidence of lifetime bondage in graves throughout Scandinavia. This was not incidental cruelty, but the economic engine that powered Viking expansion across Europe and beyond. Those who found themselves captured in Viking slave raids faced not just physical bondage, but systematic psychological conditioning designed to erase their humanity. The few who survived and eventually gained freedom carried scars that extended far beyond their physical suffering. They had been forced to witness the complete commodification of human life and their own transformation into property. The Viking Age ended not because of moral awakening, but because changing political conditions made slave raiding less profitable and more dangerous. The systematic exploitation of human beings continued as long as it remained economically viable, stopping only when external pressures made it impractical, not because Viking society developed ethical objections to human trafficking. The silence of the sources about slave suffering is itself revealing. Their voices were systematically erased, their experiences deemed unworthy of record, their humanity so completely denied that they exist in historical accounts, primarily as inventory items and property transfers. But the Vikings were not alone in weaponizing human suffering for power. Tomorrow's investigation reveals how ancient kings turned intimacy itself into a tool of domination, using sex not as pleasure, but as systematic psychological warfare that could destroy entire bloodlines and reshape empires. What other ancient civilizations built their golden ages on foundations of systematic human exploitation that we still celebrate today, without fully acknowledging the suffering that made their achievements possible?